Okay, guys. I think we are recording. Okay, so today I have part 2 of the Delphi Dates of Occurrence, Relevant Observances, Paganism, and Sacrifice. So today's presentation is a continuation of part 1. I encourage you to watch or listen to that presentation first for a fuller, more comprehensive picture of what I'm discussing today. Briefly, the first part includes some basic information on the case, some basic terminology, as well as a short overview of Carroll County history, stats, and demographics. Part 1 also includes descriptions of relevant Christian observances occurring on the dates Abby and Libby were presumed kidnapped and murdered. So this second presentation, part 2, will be covering pre-Christian European pagan observances coinciding with those dates, the 13th and 14th. It is my belief or theory or speculation, whatever you want to call it, based on the information researched and collected, that the dates when these crimes were committed are very likely connected to a non-secular pagan observance with historical ties to human sacrifice, which will be covered in the final part of the series. So, disclaimer: the theories presented in this video are by no means set in stone. They cannot be definitively proven without apprehending and then extracting information from the perpetrator or perpetrators of this crime. The point is to show that the connection exists between the dates of the murders and historically documented pagan ritual and sacrifice. This presentation is not meant to be exciting. It's not meant to entertain. It's meant to inform people following this case that there is a very strong argument to be made that the murders were meticulously planned to overtly include historical pagan symbols and acts. Regardless of accuracy applied by the perpetrator or perpetrators, the symbols exist. They are there. It's up to the viewer or listener to develop their own opinions and thoughts on whether or not they find this information compelling and or relevant to the murders of Abby and Libby. So, due to the nature of the subject matter, sad and disturbing information will be discussed, which is altogether unavoidable and therefore may be unsuitable to many viewers and listeners. Discretion is advised. So, since we addressed in part 1 the known Christian observances tied to the 13th and 14th of February, and in part 2 we'll be looking into predominantly European pagan observances, it might help to have a general understanding of the Christian-pagan overlap. So, Christianity and syncretism. So for the most part, Christianity effectively integrated pagan observances and rituals into their practices. So this integration or syncretism refers to the merging or blending of different traditions, beliefs, and practices to create a hybridization of the old with the new. So the Catholic Church deliberately included some pagan aspects like seasonal festivals, symbols, sacred sites. Well, they either co-opted or destroyed sacred sites, but and popular deities they then rebranded as saints to make the integration process less jarring. So the syncretic process helped facilitate the spread of the religion, making it more accessible to diverse populations, while also providing a sense of continuity for those transitioning from pagan to Christian beliefs. So, what is paganism? It's a great question. And whole books. Oh dear. Oh gosh. Sorry guys. Cat. So whole books have been written on the historical and scholarly application of the term. So to be brief, paganism, as understood in its modern practice form, is a diverse and decentralized spiritual movement with a wide range of beliefs and practices. There is no single monolithic definition of paganism. Individuals and groups may identify as pagan in various ways based on unique beliefs and practices, but they can be very varied. And just to address some of the common aspects of modern paganism, I also wanted to include some Christian counters to them. And they aren't a perfect one-for-one counter, but I thought it would be a good mental exercise to show where the two diverge. Besides, these are pretty obvious, like polytheism is the first and main aspect of paganism, which is the worship of multiple deities or spirits. And, these spirits or deities could be specific to a cultural pantheon of deities. They could be natural forces or elements or concepts, or like the ancient Greeks had a ton of personifications of things. So whatever the case is, it's more than one, so it's polytheism. And of course counter that with the Christian monotheism, which is the worship of one God. And they predominantly get that, of course, from Judaism, which has Yahweh. And then Islam follows in the footsteps of Christianity, so to speak. Nobody would agree with that. I'm sorry. Nobody that practices these things would agree with that, but that's just the way that I have kind of understood it. Then another aspect of paganism is nature-based spirituality, so emphasizing a profound connection to nature, respecting, acknowledging, and celebrating natural cycles. So I guess if we wanted to look at a counter for, what would be the Christian counter to this, I would say Christianity didn't necessarily reject nature, but it did distance from direct incorporation and interaction with nature. How about that? There was more of an emphasis on civilizing efforts. So, churches being built, the social hierarchy, like feudalism in the Middle Ages and whatnot, or guilds and orders, all of those things kind of revolved around religion in some aspect. And, it was less about going out into nature and more about making the group effort and the coming together of things so that the community could flourish. Again, these are all just very generalized, opinions or whatever. So take it for what it's worth. Just trying to give a basic rundown here. So another common aspect of modern paganism, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be modern, but paganism is ancestor veneration. So the honoring or remembering of, recently departed and or, distant familial connections. So, whether you're telling their stories or sharing memories or favorite pastimes that those people like to engage in, or maybe making a favorite meal, all of these things lent to keeping their spirit alive. And, You do find that in a lot of ancient pagan practice, but you still find it quite a bit in modern pagan practice, in my opinion, anyway. So, the Christian counter to this was that there was less emphasis put on ancestors, and more veneration kind of shifted to the saints or feast days that kind of maintained or upheld the fundamental religious myth. So, like you have, well, I guess you would start with Christmas kind of thing, and you would kind of work through Jesus's life, even though it's like a 3-month period, because you go from Christmas to about Easter. But there's a bunch of ritual involved. There's a bunch of different observances that had to, at least be observed, if not adhered to. Lent, Good Friday, a lot of different things that contributed to at least the Roman Catholic, I guess, like the structure of the religion. So another aspect of modern paganism is ritual and ceremony, but performed by the individual. So it was a ritual and ceremony to modern pagans is very personal, and it means working with, natural energies, or performing one's own rites to connect with spiritual forces, kind of making one's own personalized approach to the religion, or to the practice, I should say, because paganism is going to be more of a lifestyle than just a religion. Whereas when you get into formalized religion, especially, Roman Catholic, there will be an appointed member of clergy that is kind of the only intercessor, the intermediary between the devotee and God. The devotee is encouraged to pray, but they can't necessarily perform the ritual and ceremony that, like, a priest could, if that makes sense. So, and of course, like, in Roman Catholicism anyway, priests become strictly male, and then mostly educated male, starting around the 11th century Common Era. So, you're missing a whole half of the population of people that can directly commune with God. On top of not many people could become priests. But anyway, another common aspect that you'll find in modern paganism is this thing called eclecticism. So again, this is a very, generalized approach to the different aspects of paganism, but eclecticism is basically where the practitioner, the individual, will draw from a variety of sources of inspiration. So, different mythologies, different pantheons, folklore, different indigenous traditions, personal experiences, etc. So, I've seen people that they consider themselves Norse, Germanic, pagan heathens, but they also are very into the chakras, the Vedic chakras. So, or, there's a lot of variation. There's a lot of New Age that comes into it. People are even interested in, different debates that go on in physics, with consciousness and simulation theory and all of that kind of stuff. That's more of a modern innovation, but the point is that you're not limited. You can draw your inspiration from wherever you find it. And a counter to eclecticism would be akin to dogma, or a prescribed set of beliefs that are rigid and you can't really deviate from. Otherwise, like, if you were to deviate too much from Catholic dogma, you would no longer be Catholic. And you might be, borderline heretical, but, that's besides the point. Just to say that paganism is very flexible, opposed to formalized religion that does have dogma. And another common aspect is this thing called Reconstructionism. And you see this a lot, I want to say, especially in Celtic and Norse Germanic paganism, where there are surviving sources. There's definitely more surviving sources in Norse Germanic paganism than Celtic. The Celts did not write. They, like onlookers, Tacitus and Romans were looking in and commenting on their religion. But there were a lot of surviving sources from Norse Germanic paganism. And so a lot of people have taken those sources, whether they be sagas or the different Eddas. There's a lot of attestations, but they're taking the information that they're getting in those surviving texts, and they're applying it to a modern way of making new beliefs and practices, but that are based on historical and archaeological evidence. So I couldn't find a perfect counter for Reconstructionism, because at least as far as the Catholic Church goes, which of course is the first Christian church, that's the only, so Coptics might be upset with that. They're the first mainstream kind of big Christian denomination, if you want to say. They'll say that they're the OGs, but so that's why I'm always going back to Catholicism here. So when I think Reconstructionism for Catholics, or the counter to that, I would think syncretism early on. You could see that, like, the Catholics were taking from a bunch of traditions that were originally pagan, and they are reformulating them, those traditions and beliefs, to fit the narrative that they themselves are developing. But, they weren't perfectly developed right away in all their doctrine and dogma, because, you're getting all those different councils, the Council of Nicaea, and you're having to rule out whether or not you want to include Gnostic elements and different philosophies that are coming out of, Greco-Roman, even Hellenic, going into Egypt and stuff, traditions and beliefs. So syncretism helped formulate start to build that template for which the Catholic Church then, over time, developed their dogmatic doctrine. And today we see that they don't deviate pretty much ever from certain ideas, but that's not to say that they can't, but it's not a perfect one for one, is what I'm trying to say. They're not going to be looking at like historical or archaeological evidence to then try to reconstruct something. They're going to be fine with their own way of thinking and providing that practice, if that makes any sense. Who knows? So the final aspect of modern paganism, at least that we're going over right now, is modern innovation. So not all pagans do this, but it depends on the person, depends on the the culture. But a lot of people that ascribe to being pagan say that they will incorporate different elements of contemporary spirituality, but they also are big believers in putting action into one's beliefs. So environmentalism, if a lot of pagans have this connection to nature and the natural world, so environmentalism will be pretty important to them. A lot of people who feel like maybe they have been discriminated against will be huge proponents of social justice or civil rights and all sorts of things. But on top of that, like I was saying a little earlier, you don't just have to be somebody who's into antiquarian beliefs or practices. You can be somebody that is very interested in all these debates that have been coming up recently in modern physics that explores human consciousness and simulation theory or origin theory, all of that kind of stuff. So, pagans can be very flexible and they can be very diverse in their thinking, and they don't really have to ascribe to anything, But the counter to that would be, if you look at especially the Catholic Church, the counter to this modernity and innovation would be more like tradition. And it's kind of, well, why do you do that? Well, because we do. We've always done that kind of thing. But again, you'll also notice that if you dig deep, you can find the origins for a lot of tradition too. So that's just kind of a compare contrast a little bit for paganism and Christianity. But we should probably explore too how ancient Rome significantly influenced the Catholic Church. And they did so in ways that included, organization. So, probably, a lot of legal and administrative organization, hierarchy, and doctrine. So, Rome left behind a relatively intact legal and administrative system. And this helped to organize a hierarchical structure within the church in the way that the empire was previously divided into provinces, which were then overseen by governors. So too, the church was then also divided into provinces, even regions, which were called dioceses. And the dioceses were then overseen by bishops. So, just as Rome was centralized under a singular emperor during its imperial era, unlike the Republic, the Roman Republic was earlier with the Senate and the councils and the magistrates and assembly and that kind of stuff. The Catholic Church really took more from the imperial, format. So the Catholic Church was then unified under the singular command of the Pope or the papal office. And following that, the church also then took a lot of the liturgical practices that the state of Rome kind of prescribed for its people in the form of liturgy. So liturgy is just the prescribed form of public worship, and it encompassed, rituals, prayers, hymns, readings, gestures, like a bunch of different stuff. And it was meant to be done and conducted as a manner of communal worship. And so, while Rome was very known for tolerating a huge range of religious belief, and it did incorporate a lot of foreign deities. Like you look at, the cult of Isis out of Egypt, and the cult of Mithras out of Persia, but they did really want the citizens or the people within the city-state and even the empire at large to adhere to these liturgical practices. So everyone was required to engage in public communal worship, especially on certain days. And to not engage or to refuse to engage was akin to traitorous behavior. It would be kind of like, it would be perceived as secretly promoting the downfall of the state if one wasn't engaged in these communal practices. So, hence we see the problems that arose out of Judea in the early centuries, CE, and we saw it with the quote-unquote lowly Christian believers, the enslaved peoples and the servants and women, these people that, were taking a huge risk in defying the Roman state because both Judaism and Christianity, their God Yahweh is pretty hard-lined when it comes to him being the only deity worshipped. And I think because, at least in Christianity, because there is a belief in heaven and an afterlife that is, a paradise, the impetus to defy the Roman state was perhaps less terrifying because, if I die in this life that I'm constantly, suffering and toiling and just I'm not living fully, at least there will be another life of bliss for me. But of course then it caused a lot of persecution, and the Romans, it wasn't as bad as I think the Catholic Church really hyped it up to be, but it was still bad. You're still killing people in horrific ways for what they believe. And it was the persecution that was inflicted during the empire against Christian martyrs that then added to much of the early church's mythology. And the stories of the martyrs, they became like a central aspect of Catholic identity. And that, of course, then went on to influence the church's theology and spirituality. So, it did aid in contributing to what Catholicism was and what it became. So the church also solidified its power by not only serving as the continuance of the Roman Empire, but also by incorporating similar grandiose monuments, art, and architecture. And especially in the early centuries when the church was in this very precarious position, teetering between invading barbaric forces as well as a lot of political infighting. The church as an organization needed all the legitimacy it could muster. And inheriting or having formidable infrastructure left behind by, the Roman Empire, it at least aided the church in appearing legitimately powerful. So that's just some of the background that I kind of wanted to address, that there is, Catholicism and ancient Rome have a lot of overlap, and we see that in Christian observance, but we'll also see that ancient Rome played a big role on all the places that it invaded and went into and changed. So we're just going to go over ancient Roman paganism briefly, and a lot of it will be, celebrating the state and the ancestors, but we'll be going over it, at least the celebrations that take place in February, from early to mid-February, of course for relevant reasons. So the ancient Roman month of Februarius, of course, is February, and it was originally the last month of the year on the Roman calendar. So most observances or celebrations in February concerned purification, honoring the dead, or ceremonially observing a form of closure. And February itself was the shortest month of the ancient Roman calendar. It was the only month to have an even number of days, 28, to ensure the odd number of days for the year, 365, which is kind of, I didn't know exactly, does that mean that some months had 33 and 31? I don't know. I didn't want to go down that rabbit hole, but interesting nonetheless. So ancient sources believe that Februarius may be derived from this februum, which is defined as anything that consecrates or purifies. And it was difficult to discern if the februum was a ritual or an object or a combination of that. So this is what I gleaned. The februum is most often tied to a ritual involving spelt and salt. And spelt is an ancient whole grain called farro. And it seems that old or unused farro was combined with salt, probably in a bowl, a ritual bowl, and then scattered or sprinkled throughout a space or a place, or maybe even over a person. And then this magical act of scattering or sprinkling an item over something or someone for purification is called aspersing. So the ancient Romans did not number the days of the month, and instead they wrote it out like this, in this column. And this is actually a yearly, this was the it's a reproduction of the Fasti Antiates Maiores painted wall calendar from the late Roman Republic. And then this is the detail of February. So, not our standard modern wall calendar grid with, the weekdays, but listed out in this way, which I thought was very interesting. And they didn't number the days of the month sequentially from the first through the last day. Instead, they used 3 fixed points of the month. So they had the calends, the nones, and the ides. And those points were then used to count backwards to determine the other days of the month, which quickly got really confusing for me. So again, I did not go down that rabbit hole, but the calends was always on the first day of the month. The nones usually fell on the 5th or 7th day of the month, depending on the month's length. For February, because it's shorter, it fell on the 5th of February. And then the ides fell on the 13th or 15th of the month and corresponded with the day of the full moon. And the ides of February fell on the 13th day of the month. So again, we have another coinciding observance with, the dates of occurrence for the girls. And quickly, the ides, the word ides derives from a Latin word that means to divide. The months of March, May, July, and October all had the ides falling on the 15th day, and every other month the ides fell on the 13th day. And this way of calculating the calendar was, with the ides being the full moon, was probably based on a prehistoric lunar calendar, where the first sliver of the new crescent moon, which would be a day or two after the new moon or dark moon, that sliver signified the calends and the first day of the month. And then, as it progressed forward, the first quarter moon that was half dark and half illuminated signified the nones, and then the full moon, of course, signified the ides. But the calends of each month was sacred to Juno, and the ides to Jupiter. And Juno is, of course, the wife to Jupiter, and, she's kind of the Greek kind of equivalent to Hera. She seems more likable than Hera, but Juno does have a lot of significance, especially going over in the next slide, the different observances for February. But the day before each of these 3 days, the calends, the nones, and the ides, is called the pridi. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. And then the day after is called the postridi. But these days that are before the calends, the nones, and the ides are also referred to as the dies atri, or atri. And these are quote-unquote black days, which were generally regarded as inauspicious or unlucky. And I really wanted to dive deeper into this because I wanted to see if potentially the Romans had a lot of unlucky days, so I really wanted to look into it, but it was a little difficult to determine what all of those days were. But there were days that were considered, more lucky and less lucky on the calendar. So, going over the ancient Roman festivals for February, we're just looking at the 1st through the mid-month of February. So, in this case, it'll be the 1st through the 15th. But many festivals and religious observances reflect the Romans' agrarian way of life in their early history. So, Roman polymath Varro, who's circa 116 to 27 BCE, he divided the Roman agricultural year into 8 phases, with spring beginning officially on the 7th of February, and or when the west wind, called Favonius, the Favonius wind, began blowing favorably. The changing winds signified the time to weed the grain fields, tend to the vineyards, prune fruit and olive trees, etc. It was a time to purge the land, to clear away old debris for new plantings, or to replenish nutrients in the soil. And there are a lot of agrarian duties that specifically reserved for the month of February, and these duties suggest the close ties between agriculture and religion in Roman culture. So the 1st of February is the Dies Natalis, which is basically its birthday, but it also is it's meant to be a commemorative day or a day of dedication to a deity or temple. So the 1st of February, the calends, is the Dies Natalis of the temple to Juno Sospita. And Juno, of course, is a patron for women and children, and Juno Sospita meaning savior or preserver. And this again will have ties to Candlemas and the purification of the Virgin, which we'll cover on the next slide, but I just want people to remember that Juno is showing up here, and she will also show up on the 13th and 14th. So then when we look at the next date for February, the 5th of February, the Nones, okay, this is also a Dies Natalis, but it's to the Temple of Concordia on the Capitoline Hill, and Concordia is the goddess of peace and harmony. The next observance, the 11th and 12th of February, is this Ludi Genialici. I'm not sure how you say that, but they were the games for the genius, and this started like around the mid-1st century CE, but it basically was probably the typical games, whether that was like chariot racing or like Colosseum, gladiator fighting. They were held to honor the guiding spirits or the divine essence of ancient Roman families or notable figures, the kind of like guardian angels associated with either popular families or people, and they were believed to protect and influence the people of Rome, or potentially honoring the individual. So it could be the guardian angel connected to the individual, or it could be the guardian angel connected to the collective whole, if that makes sense. And I'm using guardian angel just because that's kind of what I'm referring to, these guiding spirits, but it was different, okay? It was not the same. I'm just using that incorrectly, but that's how I see it. So then we get to the Ides of February. So the 13th of February was the Ides. There is an observance, the Dies Natalis of the temple to Faunus, who was, akin to the Greek god Pan, but Faunus, he was associated with fertility and agriculture, and he would have been honored on the 13th on the Tiber Island, which, I don't know what that is. So I'm not sure if everybody in the empire celebrated him or if this was just very specific to Tiber Island, but the Ides of February is, it does have a connection to Faunus. And following, kind of overlapping with the Ides, because it does begin again on the Ides, is this festival called the Parentalia. The Parentalia goes from the 13th to the 22nd of February. It's a 9-day festival, and it begins with a public rite performed or conducted by the head or the chief of the Vestal Virgins. And this rite was done for the collective de parentes, or the ancestors of the Roman people. And the parentalia or parentatio was a commemorative time to honor familial ancestors and propitiate the dead. So the festival began at the 6th hour to appease the manes, and the manes were these revered spirits of deceased ancestors. But when they say it begins at the 6th hour, in ancient Rome, the day began at midnight. Interestingly enough, it began at midnight, or the media nox, middle of the night. So 6 hours out from that, to me, would be probably around sunrise, and which also coincides with the fact that many cultures and I guess like folklore beliefs always kind of make it known that you shouldn't be like seeking out the dead or, you know, calling upon them in the dark. So to me, I don't know if that's accurate, but that's why I incorporated this, that it began in the 6th hour. So I believe it started at sun up on the 13th. And temples would be closed. No altar fires were allowed to be burned. Marriages were forbidden. And magistrates were forced to remove their insignia at least until the 21st. So all of that's very interesting. But parentalia is going to overlap both with the Ides, with the Ides, with the Festival of Juno, and then also with Lupercalia. So, you know, that parentalia begins on the 13th. At the same time, there's also, between the 13th and 14th of February, the Festival of Juno Februa, or Juno the Purifier, or Juno the Chaste. And again, we'll be looking at this a little closer in the observance of the purification of the Virgin, or Candlemas, on the next slide. And then to quickly cover the 15th of February, probably the best known ancient Roman observance is Lupercalia. So also known as Lupercal or Februa. This was a pastoral yearly festival of ancient Rome, and it was basically done to purify and protect the city, and to ward off evil spirits and promote health and fertility. And it was dedicated to Lupercus, who was a god of shepherds and fertility. And of course his name Luper is from the Latin lupa. Lupa is wolf. So, you know, I assume that Lupercus is a god that has some wolf-like associations, as well as Faunus. And Faunus, again, of course, is the kind of Roman equivalent, more or less, of Pan, the Greek Pan. And Faunus also had a lot of associations with goats, and he was a deity of fertility and agriculture. So we're getting both the pastoral, the god of shepherds, which is funny that they put a wolf god in charge of, you know, shepherds who look after sheep. Maybe that, I don't know. And then they have Faunus, who is a randy little goat man. And then they also sacrificed goats and dogs during this ritual. So, you know, I speculated maybe too they were running low on food stores at this time. You know, their grain was probably dwindling, hence why maybe they did the spelt and salt, where they would, you know, combine the farro with salt and throw it around because the grain was old, or maybe it was even moldy kind of thing, and they had to get rid of it. But yeah, February for a lot of cultures that experience longer winters is usually a kind of a harsh month because it's too soon to get harvest up and going, or agriculture up and going, so that you can harvest something to eat. And if animal meat was preserved, they would be running low on those stores, and or roots, roots like potatoes and beets and carrots and parsnip, all those things, all those kind of root foods could have been running low on as well. So perhaps why they had to, begin sacrificing goats and dogs. But this was part of the purification process because the participants of Lupercalia would likely be sprinkled with the blood of these sacrificed animals. And young men known as Luperci or Luperci, again, not sure how to say that, they would cut strips of goat hide from the animals, and then they would run through the streets of Rome, and they would, it says, lightly striking bystanders. I don't know if they did that. They lightly would strike bystanders, especially women, with the strips of hide, which is, who's to say that, in a bunch of years, somebody won't look back on our things and be like, wow, that was weird. But a little weird. So it was believed that this ritual would promote fertility and ensure the well-being of the city. But, Lupercalia was also linked to the founding myth of Rome, where the two orphan brothers, Romulus and Remus, who were the legendary founders of the city, they were taken care of by a she-wolf, the Lupa. And they were taking care of the she-wolf in a cave known as the Lupercal, which is probably the cave of the wolf. But yeah, this festival was a commemoration of this mythological event. Lupercalia was regarded as a festival of purification, fertility, and the rituals were aimed at ensuring the fertility of the land, livestock, and people, as well as offering protection against infertility, illness, and malevolent forces. So overall, ancient Rome had many varied observances, the majority of which focused heavily on the cohesion and unity of the state. And February would have been particularly important during imperial expansion, as the following month, March, named for the Roman deity Mars, was the beginning of the campaign season. Many Roman soldiers were recruited farmers, and doing much of the labor-intensive work of preparing the land would have been essential before going off for training and then months-long or longer excursions into unknown lands. Because after that, it would be up to the women, servants, or slaves to do the rest of the work. And that was hard work. So, now to just touch briefly on this purification of the Virgin and Candlemas. There are some connections that I think get carried over from ancient Rome into Christianity, and that Christianity is also borrowing from other pagan holidays. And the purification of the Virgin is a Christian celebration. It commemorates the presentation of Jesus at the temple in Jerusalem. And this is found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verse 22 through 40. And according to Jewish tradition, the Taharat HaMishpacha, or this family purity, it was determined certain practices meant to be followed to guide a couple's intimate relationship after childbirth and or menstruation. as the woman was considered ritually unclean for a certain period of time. And this period of purification after childbirth is referred to as the Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galut, meaning the second day of the festival of exile. So it was after this time then the woman could then go to the temple to offer sacrifices for purification. And the purification of the virgin was observed on the 2nd of February, or 40 days after Christmas. And it's considered significant in the liturgical calendar as it symbolizes the entry of Christ, the light of the world, into the temple. The feast is known as Candlemas due to the custom of blessing candles during the celebration. But Candlemas has also been conflated with the Celtic pagan Imbolc, which is a festival marking the midpoint between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. It's typically celebrated on or between the 1st and 2nd of February. Of course, the 1st in ancient Rome was celebrating the Calends and was dedicated to Juno. And it's, so Imbolc, the ancient Celtic origins of Imbolc celebrated the goddess Brigid, who represented healing, poetry, and smithcraft in Celtic mythology, but who was also later transformed into the Roman Catholic Saint Brigid of Kildare, who is the patron saint of Ireland, or one of them, but she's pretty important. Modern pagans celebrate Imbolc as a time to acknowledge the growing power of the sun as winter begins to wane and the days grow longer. And it's often celebrated with rituals involving fire and light, such as lighting candles or bonfires. And these activities symbolize the return of warmth and light as the earth prepares for spring. It is also associated with purification and renewal, reflecting the theme of preparing for the coming spring planting season. So people may clean their homes during this time, signifying a time for physical and spiritual cleansing. And then some modern pagan and or Wiccan communities celebrate Imbolc / Candlemas, because they call them either or, as one of the 8 Sabbats or holidays of the Wheel of the Year. So in the final part of the series, Candlemas will also be a substitute for other pagan holidays or observances. And ideas of renewal, purification, and purity continue to appear in many pagan observances beginning in early to mid-February. In part 1, we recall that the Feast of St. Valentine served as an early spring observance before it became better known for its modern commercial application. However, previously the 13th and 14th of February were considered sacred to Juno Februa, Juno the Purifier, or chaste Juno, Juno the Chaste. After Christianization, we see the celebration of the chaste woman being celebrated earlier in February during Candlemas. So, just as kind of like an overview, I hope the picture I'm painting is becoming more clear. We are seeing patterns that are showing up in many similar forms despite different periods of time and different cultures. The idea of cultural diffusion shows that people and ideas are not stagnant, but rather dynamic. People have been intermingling through travel, migration, exodus, etc. And that gives them the opportunity to learn and take on new ideas, and maybe even assimilate some of those ideas for their own personal or social beliefs and practices. So many things influence everything. There is no original story. Everything stems from major ideas, and whether humans get those ideas through interaction or the ideas develop parallel to other conceptions, we all share a similar mythos. And while I cannot strictly say that the murders of Abby Williams and Libby German in 2017 were done to usher in the spring season or because they were likely pure virginal girls, I cannot dismiss that their murders coincided with known historical dates and facts tied to those dates. The final part of the series will hopefully bring more of these facts together, but I would hope that you'd wait until then before you possibly write off this research as coincidental or arbitrary. I'm also hoping that the signatures left at the crime scene are likewise being considered, that the girls were posed, and that sticks were placed over them in a manner resembling Germanic runes, and that those Germanic runes are discernible, if not subjectively so, but they are there nonetheless. So thank you for your time. I realize these presentations are tedious and probably very boring for the average attention span. I appreciate each and every one of you who takes the time to try and slog through them. I consider myself, and hopefully others do that know me well too, as having a mostly reasonable disposition. I wouldn't intentionally waste my own time, or yours for that matter, if I truly didn't believe that what I'm seeing and what I've learned were unimportant. So thank you. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Please stay tuned for part 3, hopefully the last part of this series, at least the series on the dates. And please take care of yourselves. Have an excellent week.